Abbeville, South Carolina, and my father was from Winnsboro, South Carolina. He went to Davidson College and Princeton for seminary, and then went to the Presbyterian Church in Abbeville, South Carolina, where my mother was the music director. And so they met there and got married. And soon after that, a missionary came and spoke about how wonderful the missions were. And they decided that would be wonderful. And so they went to China, where they lived in Nanking most of the time, summers in Kuling. And he became dean of a theological seminary there in Nanking for Chinese students. My parents had a son they named Donald Jr. in China, but he died of infection after getting scratched with a scooter. And they had another son they named Hugh, who had some sort of digestive complaint. They came home on furlough, and my mother's mother took care of Hugh while my mother went to the sand with my father. And she always regretted that she thought maybe she could have saved him. But anyway, Hugh died. And I had an older sister named Oreen, who was my favorite. She used to tickle my back so I could go to sleep. And my younger sister, Florence, was a big pianist, and she was always practicing and didn't pay any attention to me. So in 1925, I was born. In 1927, I was 2, and Chiang Kai-shek was coming up from the south to fight warlords, but some of his soldiers were pretty ruffian. So the women and children got put on gunboats in the Yangtze River, U.S. gunboats. And my father decided to stay behind just to see what was going on, I think. After a while, some Chinese soldiers approached his house where he was standing on the balcony on the second floor above the porch, the floor above the porch. And they looked pretty menacing, so he threw all his money out in front of them and ran through the house and jumped out the second-story window and broke his leg and crawled in the ditch. And the Chinese, they were sympathetic, took him in and hid him in a haystack, where he spent the night, and the next day the Marines came off the gunboats and rescued him. My mother and my sisters and I were on another gunboat, and she didn't know whether he lived or died for a couple of weeks. They finally got back together and decided to come home. And he had tuberculosis of the lung and spent a year at the sanatorium, and the mission board decided they didn't want him to go back. He was in a sanatorium in Asheville, North Carolina, I think. Mother and the two sisters and I settled in Mission Court in North Richmond in an apartment on the second floor, and lived there until he got out of the sand and could assume his faculty position at Union Theological Seminary. About 29, I suspect. So we lived on Chamberlain, 3218 Chamberlain, until I was 6. While we were there, I remember falling in a briar bush and getting switched by my mother. But mostly I remember with pleasure sitting on the front porch with my father during thunderstorms, which I thought were great. And one afternoon we were sitting on the porch, and an auto gyro came floating by dragging a sign that said Al Smith for president. So it must have been 32. When I was 6, we moved to 1006 Westwood Avenue, which was almost across Westwood Avenue from the house on Chamberlain. And I grew up there on 1006 Westwood till I went away to college. My room was right above the music room, so I could hear my sister Florence practicing and teaching, which annoyed me no end. She tried to teach me piano, but I failed after about a week. The seminary campus has a big ellipse of green grass in the center. And we lived next door to some people named Lacey, and next door to them were some people named Mack, and across the ellipse was a family named Bear and another one named Thompson, and they all became good friends. Went to Guinea Park School, had to walk every day to school. First day I went, it was very foggy, and I was afraid I'd get lost in the mist, but I didn't. Had good friends there. When I was in kindergarten, I painted ever-brown trees, and they figured out I was colorblind. But I skipped the second half of kindergarten and got into the first grade with a bunch that I have been friends with ever since. We just went to the 90th birthday party of one of them, and they have remained really good friends forever. After that, I went to Chandler Junior High for a couple of years, and then to Thomas Jefferson High School. When I was a junior there, I met Frances Wingfield. I was the editor of the newspaper and editor, and she wrote poems, and I used to have to go to her house to beleaguer her into delivering a poem so we could print it in the next week's paper. And in the process, I guess we fell in love, and we dated a lot during high school. She went to Ranolph-Macon and I went to Davidson, and I used to thumb a rod up from North Carolina to Ranolph-Macon to see her as often as I could. We were poor, both of us. Well, I was at any rate. So when we graduated from college, she went to OT, Occupational Therapy School in New York at Columbia University. We drifted apart. She sicked me on a classmate of hers with whom I promptly fell in love. But after a while, Frances decided she wanted to get married. So in '48, when I was third year in medical school, we got married here in Richmond at Guinea Park Presbyterian Church, where my father and the local preacher did the ceremony. We had a honeymoon in the Pocono Mountains, Pennsylvania, I think they are. A lot of other honeymoon couples there. And then we went to live in Boston. Frances practiced her occupational therapy by that time. She decided to become a psychiatric occupational therapist. And she worked at a hospital way out on the outskirts of Boston called Mattapan, where I occasionally went. And the next winter, I bought a Buick, I think, from a faculty member at the medical school for $800. And not very long after I bought it, I drove out there to pick Frances up and opened the door with an oncoming car, which crashed into the door, and it was a big mess. Got the door fixed. graduated from medical school, and we enjoyed life in Boston, good restaurants and good friends, a lot of good friends, some of whom I have remained friendly with for eons. So after Donald was born, we stayed in Boston for about 9 months and then moved to New Haven. First lived in a slum in East New Haven that had red and white stripes painted up the walls and across the ceiling and down the other wall. After a while, we moved to a Quonset hut, which the leftover from the war on the Yale polo field. And we lived in a Quonset hut for the rest of the time in Yale and made close friends with some people named Seton. He was a psychiatrist, or he was going to be a psychiatrist. He was a resident in New Haven. And they remained good friends as long as they lived. They're both dead now. And their children have remained good friends. After I finished 2 years of residency, I decided I ought to come home and take care of my parents. So we moved to Richmond, to a house on a street called Rolling Road. What I remember most about Rolling Road was some hurricane that came along. And when the eye was there, Sarah went out into the yard, and Francis had to rescue her when the other side of the hurricane came along. We lived there for, 5 years or so. Well, I finished residency, 2 more years at MCV. I had been great friends with a famous professor of endocrinology named Albright in Boston. And he invited me to come back and be a fellow when I was finishing my first year of residency at MCV, and I'd already agreed to be the chief resident, one of the 3 chief residents. And Dr. Porter wouldn't turn me loose. So instead of becoming an endocrinologist, I stayed at MCV and was the chief resident and got hooked up with Jack Patterson. And that's how I became a cardiologist. The other 2 chief residents were your father and John Boyd Bullock. So after finishing the residency, I went to McGuire Veterans Hospital because T. Thompson was the chief of medicine there, and he said if I could read an EKG, he would make me chief of cardiology. And I could, so he did. And I worked there for about 5 years. It was a grand time. I got some good research done. So I worked at the VA, and meanwhile, T. Thompson had become chairman of the Department of Medicine at MCV, and he offered me a job as associate professor. And the first year was to be paid by a grant from the Virginia Heart Association, and part of the grant was that we could spend it anywhere we wanted to study. So we moved to Oxford, England, where I worked with a professor of medicine who was named Sir George Pickering, who was the Queen's Professor of Medicine at Oxford University. And we got some good research done there mostly on measuring nighttime blood pressure. And I came back and worked at MCV, and in '74, a grateful patient offered to pay my salary for another year abroad doing research. So we moved to Milan, Italy, and lived there for a year. I bought a BMW on the way, and did research on mostly on nerves to the kidneys and how they affect blood pressure. Donald was born in '50 in Boston. Sarah was born in New Haven. And David wasn't born until we got back here to Richmond, and he was born in 1956. We had one other child. Francis had a disorder called amniotic fluid embolism, where the fluid that surrounds the baby got into the mother's blood, and it caused all the blood there to clot, and then when it uses up all the clot, she started bleeding up a storm. The obstetrician was very good, and they gave her some new experimental drug that would help with blood clotting. Anyway, she stopped bleeding and was unconscious, comatose for days, maybe a couple of weeks. She gradually began to talk before she opened her eyes. But she finally got over it. The baby lived about 6 months, most of it in the orphanage in Lynchburg, Virginia. When we came back from Italy, let's see, Donald was then in medical school and couldn't leave until he got through, and his future wife's parents wouldn't let her go until they got married. So they got married and then came to Italy, and we toured around. Sarah had gone with us to a school in Switzerland, and we used to go up and see her a lot with my BMW. And David lived with us in Milan. After we came back, I got to be chairman of the Department of Cardiology, Division of Cardiology, for a long time, and my chief success was getting George Vetrovic, who took over after I retired and stopped being chairman, and really built a great division of cardiology. Another great contributor was Hermes Kantos, who came from Cyprus and whose father was the Secretary of State for Cyprus. And they were a very bright family. Hermes probably the brightest person I ever know. He got to be vice president of VCU for MCV, and one of the buildings down there is named after him. None are named after me, I'm sorry to say. Donald and Ann had 2 children. One is named Kaz. He's a lawyer in Norfolk. He married a Russian girl who's very pretty, who suddenly developed multiple sclerosis and is sort of confined. She's not confined to her home, but she has trouble getting around. They have one daughter named Sophia, who's now about 7. Donald and Ann's other child was a daughter named Leslie, who has become a doctor and is a family practitioner in Seattle, where she got married to a very peachy guy who's got a big job at Microsoft. And they are expecting another great-grandchild in September. Francis Wingfield's father became vice president of Benjamin Moore paint company, which was very remunerative, and he left her a lot of money. $1 million of which she left for a charitable remainder trust fund for Randolph Macon, women's scholars. Frances was excellent as a docent at the museum and as a cook, and she became a master gardener, took all kinds of courses from VPI, and had a wonderful garden at our home, which was 5501 Queensberry Road. She even had a pit dug in which we put cloth, like waterproof stuff, and had a pool with fish in it. After a while, a great blue heron became very fond of our fish. We had to put a net over the pond to keep him out. So we lived happily there until Frances caught that shaky disease. I'll think of it in a minute. She didn't have much trouble with shaking, but she became more and more rigid. First, we hired a nurse to come there and help look after her, but after a while she became too rigid, and we had to move to Westminster Canterbury, where she lived in health care until 2007, when she died, I guess, from the Parkinson's disease. Parkinson was the name of the disease. And so that story ended. A few months later, I was up visiting a friend in healthcare. Across the hall was Frances Holliday, whom I viewed with great approval, and we've been together ever since. And I think that's all.